Question 95 is on human law, and to be more specific, it's on human law generally speaking. We'll see in question 96, it's kind of more particular, takes a different facet of human law, namely on the power of human law. So these first two articles are just kind of talking about human law in general. The first article asks the question of whether it's useful to have laws framed by human beings. And ultimately he says, yes, it is useful. And these are kind of like the most salient points. The first thing he talks about is just kind of a cool kind of side note. He kind of reflects on the fact that in the development of, I guess, the species, we kind of exchange things that are useful for survival, like fur and claws, for reason. I mean, at this point, I would have liked to talk about how evolution isn't or can't primarily be guided by pure pragmatism. Otherwise, it would make no real sense for us to lose the practical things like fur and claws. But what we lack in kind of natural means of survival, like killer instincts, etc., we make up for with reason, and we can make do with reason. Anyways, just kind of an interesting observation that when you look at kind of the evolution of species, we become less killery and the more rational we get. Anyways, so the other big point that he makes, probably the main one, is he does talk about how, for some people, parental teaching is satisfactory. That's all you really need. All you really need is, mom and dad to say, don't touch the stove or don't do X. And that's going to be enough. The fear of, disappointing their parents or the fear of punishment is, well, maybe not that, but just the fear of like not being seen as a good son or daughter. A lot of times that is enough for some kids, but not all children are created equally. Some do need that harsher punishment in order to foster kind of a fear of doing the wrong thing. And this is essentially where we get kind of the discipline of laws. So it is useful to have human law, because just saying what the right thing is and hoping that they do it isn't really enough, because not everyone is going to do the right thing just because they know it's the right thing. A lot of them are going to follow their passions and follow, their inclinations, even when they're not inclining them to the right thing. So this is human law is especially helpful when we are young, because when we're young, it's really easy to make mistakes regarding kind of what we're inclined to. We make more mistakes when we're young because we're inexperienced and we don't think long term. That's why it's almost a trope now of a person in their teens getting in a crazy car accident or drinking and driving or all these other things. Not to say that older people don't make those mistakes, but they do seem to be more common when they're young, especially when they're at that point where they can have some autonomy over their body and their actions, but they don't yet have enough experience to really be thoughtful and considerate and think about the repercussions of their actions. Anyways, and this article kind of ends with a really killer quotation from Aristotle's Politics, namely, "As man is the most noble of animals, if he be perfect in virtue, so he is the lowest of all, if he be severed from law and righteousness." And I just really like that image that of all the animals in the world, when we are virtuous, we are the greatest animals. But when we are not reasonable, we're actually the lowest of the animals, because we can do better. A dog can be trained or untrained, but it can't really, decrease in its dogness. Like, it just is what it is. We have a choice. And when we choose to do the wrong thing, when we make that act of the will, when we abuse our reason, that is to not use it, we are lower than all of the animals. We're worse than the dogs and the worms because we are able to be better, and we've chosen not to. It's just a really powerful line from Aristotle. Anyways, moving into the second article, he asks the question of whether every human law is derived from natural law. Again, we're kind of departing from natural law, which again is our participation in eternal law, and human law seems to be wholly developed by humanity. And obviously it can be in accordance with eternal law, or it could not be, because again, we have that free will. And he quotes Augustine. He talks about how if a law falls short of the law of nature, it is no longer law, but a perversion of law. So if a law falls short of the law of nature, if it is in contradiction or goes against natural law, or the laws of nature, like just the nature of the kinds of things that we are, then that is not a law, but a perversion of law. One kind of easy example that again kind of goes back to this to the divine law being handed down to the Israelites with the Mosaic law. 6 days you have to work and 1 day for rest. That's not just an arbitrary thing that God invented, that because it's 7 days of creation and God worked for 7 days. Christ tells us in the Gospels that the Sabbath is like for your benefit. It is healthy to have 1 day of rest a week. And kind of an example of where some people tried to get away from that during the French Revolution. They instituted a 10-day week because 10 is a nice, round number, and we work in a decimal system. We like the number 10 more than the number 7. And so they tried to institute a 10-day week, and it didn't go that well. It didn't last for very long because it kind of threw our bodies out of whack. Working that many consecutive days just isn't healthy for us. And again, that's divine wisdom under the guise of, divine arbitrariness. But in reality, it's actually very good for us to have to work no more than like 6 consecutive days, to have that time of rest. We do need it for our social, emotional, and physical health. And so if a law were to put in place where you were mandated to work, more than that, then that would not be in accordance with our nature. That would be a perversion of law. Anyways, and with regard to the forming of human laws, with a mind towards the natural law, he talks about how there are kind of 2 ways that a law could be derived from natural law. The first one is as a conclusion from premises, and that is kind of the step-by-step rational process. And he talks about how it's kind of similar to the sciences. You start from first principles, and you come to certain conclusions, and these conclusions, which are human laws, are derived from natural law. Kind of a very pure transition. And he gives the example of very common and overt things like murder or theft or rape. Those things, we can make rational arguments from natural law to come to the conclusion that these are not good things to do. The second way that it can be derived from natural law is from certain generalities, and he compares this to the arts. Now, I don't want to say that it's based purely on a kind of intuition, as if to say that it's pure arbitrariness, but it can have that flavor, that tinge. It is not necessarily a deductive argument where you can lay out all the steps very clearly, but it does still make sense. So kind of some examples of the second way would be something like the speed limit, right? It does have a tinge of arbitrariness, whether the speed limit is 65 or 70 on a freeway. But all the same, it is reasonable and good that we do have certain limits to our speed, depending on kind of where we are in the world, versus school zone versus a freeway. So still good, still from reason, but that kind of law isn't necessarily grounded in natural law, at least not in the same way that it's from deductive reasoning from those premises. It's still in accord with nature, right? It's still in accord with reason, but it's not as deductive as other conclusions. And then the last kind of note that he makes is that conclusions or laws from this first way of deriving has all of the force of the natural law. That is to say, it has the force of eternal law. That is a very high place of authority. The second one doesn't have the same force, but we should still obey them, at least for the most part, because they are still in accord with reason. That distinction is kind of an important one to keep in mind. Pure deductive reasoning, and then just kind of like from a feel of like, this is what makes sense, this is reasonable. We can make human laws from these two modes, and that's the connection between human law coming from natural law. Question 96 continues the study of human law, specifically on the power of human law. So you've already read the first couple of articles, so that's what's going to be discussed in this particular segment. So let's take a look at the first one, whether human law should be framed for the community rather than for the individual. Now maybe this is like it should be for the community, not the individual. But it's still a good thing to kind of establish and lay down, especially when it comes to talking about rulers. This is one of the key things that separates a just ruler from a tyrant, someone who makes laws or governs for themselves versus for everyone else. Likewise, a law can be just or tyrannical, depending on whether it's for the community or for an individual. And so he quotes, I think it was Hilary or Isidore, saying that human law should be proportional. That's the symbol in mathematics, at least, for proportionality. So human law should be proportional to the common good, because the human law should be proportional to what it is about. And what it is about is the common good, going back to our definition of law in general. So human law should be proportional to the common good, but the common good itself, it has many facets. There are many communities, many people, different parts of the lives of those people that it can entail. Therefore, it's going to require many actions to attain that common good. But again, the subject of that common good is the community, not just the individual. It's not to say that the individual's good isn't taken into account. But again, the primary focus for laws is the common good, not to the exclusion of the individual good, but it is the primary concern. Again, you get a tyrannical law when you focus on elevating the good of an individual or a select group of individuals rather than the common good. That will be to the detriment of the common good. The second article is whether it belongs to human law to repress all vice. Now again, we have talked about this a number of times about how you can prohibit certain things, but you can't really make a law for everything because there's an infinite number of ways to be vicious. The way of the virtue is very narrow. There's maybe one way to be virtuous, but you can fall into the pit on either side. There's infinitely more ways to mess up than there is to do the right thing. But he kind of approaches the question in a different way. I really liked Aquinas' approach to this. He talks about, first with this example, that the law of children is not the same as the law for adults. Children do things and get away with it because they're children. And if an adult were to do that, well, they wouldn't. Imagine an adult throwing a temper tantrum in a grocery store. Maybe they get away with it, but people just look at them weird. But children, lie, cheat, steal all the time. The little savages, and they can get away with it because they're children, and we make that accommodation. But if an adult were to do that, that's crime, and that's not acceptable. So the law of children and the law of adults is not the same thing. And he says that this is similar to the law for people who don't have perfect virtue versus law of a virtuous people. They are not the same. And for the most part, communities are of the former. They're closer to the law of children. They are people who don't yet have perfect virtue. Therefore, human law cannot forbid all vices, but it can, prohibit the most grievous of vices, especially those that do harm to other. And he gives the examples of murder and theft. Those ones, like, everyone can understand why this is a wrong thing and avoid it. But in terms of the law of the virtuous person, not everyone is going to see the good in doing, all these virtuous acts. And so human law can't cover all vices, but only the ones that everyone can understand. You kind of have to start with that lowest common denominator. What are the things that everyone can understand and we can make laws against? And again, that kind of reflects the morality of the people in general. If a certain community happened to be more virtuous than another people, they could potentially have human law that forbids more vices than a more, pagan culture, for instance. That could certainly happen. But again, this is kind of Aquinas' approach that when you are making human laws, you can't forbid all vices, because you can't expect everyone to be striving for perfection. But what you can do is forbid the things that are the lowest common denominator, the things that everyone can agree on are wrong. And that's the evolution of human law, either more towards virtue or away from it. That's just something to kind of keep in mind, that that is the limit of human law. It can't forbid all vices, but it can forbid the ones that we all agree on.